Greetings and welcome back to my series on becoming God's people, where we are looking at Genesis through Deuteronomy and how that relates to God forming the people of Israel and taking one family and making them um, the people by whom God would interact with the world. Sorry if you watched or tried to watch last week's video. Somewhere along the way, the sound got messed up and deleted. I'm not exactly sure where that happened, and I didn't notice it until after it had been published. So I'm taking that video down, and we're going to talk a little bit about those themes this week as we continue in the book of Exodus. Last week, we talked about, or in my reflection last week, I was reflecting on the plague of hail. See, I'm doing it again. It's so ingrained. I don't mean to say plague. The sign, the blow of hail. This idea that God is not plaguing Egypt, but using wonders and miracles to show signs of power and authority. So this sign of hail, or this miracle of hail, um, that's what I looked at in my reflection last week. This week we are going into the death of the firstborn, the final true sign to Egypt. Some scholars will obviously say that the crossing of the Red Sea is the last sign, but generally speaking, most people accept that this is this death of the firstborn. And last week I talked about how the signs are broken up into three groups of three. Traditionally, people see them as three groups of three, and then this one is a capstone over all of them. And that is because you see this repetitive nature of the first nine, from the Nile River turning to blood all the way up through the sign of darkness. There's this repetitive nature to each group of three, and then this one stands out. It stands out for any number of reasons, but most especially because it is the only time where God targets humans and human life. In fact, it's really the first time that God is in some ways unapologetically targeting human life in a miracle. And we need to pause and reflect on that and see what is going on in the whole scenario that is causing God to do this. Now, I've said from the beginning that most people will try to argue about God hardening Pharaoh's heart as a sign that God was making Pharaoh into this stone figure who is not able to truly enact his own will. And so God's forcing Pharaoh to act in a certain way. And that just isn't the case. What we see time and again is that Pharaoh is choosing between whether he wants to rule over Egypt or rule over Israel. All of these signs are because God has said, Israel is my firstborn, and you don't have the right to control Israel. And these signs are God saying to Pharaoh, if you are going to try to control my firstborn of Israel, then I'm going to take away what control you think you have over your own people. And this starts in the first true sign of the turning the Nile to blood. Pharaoh, you can either control Israel or you can control the Nile. You can't have both. And Pharaoh chooses to control Israel, or try to control Israel, and so God strikes the Nile. And that continues again and again. Each time Pharaoh is given this option, and Pharaoh chooses to try to control everything. Part of this is because his priests are able to duplicate what God is doing through Moses. And so in Pharaoh's mind, what I think is going on is he sees his priests duplicating what Moses is doing, and he thinks that Moses is a magician on the level of his priests. So he sees Moses turn water to blood. His priest can do it. Okay, well, you're only a magician on the level of my priests. You have not risen to my level yet. And throughout that process, this is giving him a false sense of security. It is bolstering his own resolution. It is strengthening Pharaoh's resolve. And that is what the words hardening his heart means. Strengthening his resolve. Not being calloused or cruel, but just simply strengthening his resolve. And as Pharaoh goes through this, his magicians are again and again repeating the signs that Moses and Aaron do. And so Pharaoh thinks, well, he is a magician like my magicians. Until suddenly Pharaoh's magicians can't duplicate the sign. And then with the plague of boils, Pharaoh's magicians are actually taken out of the picture. They're not even present in front of Moses. They are physically unable to attend to Pharaoh because they are diseased. In the ancient world, disease was a reason to not be around the king. You weren't allowed around the king if you were diseased. It was a sign of weakness or inferiority, or in some way you were deemed less than. And this is a true sign that Pharaoh has no power, because his magicians, who are supposed to be people who bring healing, one of their jobs was to bring healing to Pharaoh and his court. Well, they weren't able to do that. And in fact, they weren't even able to heal themselves, which is a real hit to their power and their prestige. And now Pharaoh needs to be bolstered from another area, and we see God step in to strengthen Pharaoh's resolve. Again, strengthen his resolve. His resolve is to maintain this illusion of control. And we know that because in chapter 10, immediately after all of this transpires and God starts to strengthen Pharaoh's resolve, harden Pharaoh's heart, as tradition tells us, in chapter 10, God strengthens the resolve of Pharaoh and his officials. That's chapter 10, verse 3. And then in chapter 10, verse 7, the first time Pharaoh's officials are introduced as real characters, they are advising Pharaoh to release Israel. Their hearts were hardened to release Israel, where Pharaoh's heart is hardened to not release Israel. It is not God projecting an idea on Pharaoh. This is not God overcoming Pharaoh's own will and determination. This is God saying to Pharaoh, here's what you want. You want a specific outcome. Fine, I will give you that specific outcome that you desire. You desire to maintain this illusion of control. Meanwhile, your advisors, they do not desire this illusion of control. They desire to be rid of the people of Israel, so I'm going to strengthen their resolve towards that end. And we see this, and now it's the first time that God has intervened and has caused division among the Egyptians. And that division is permanent. Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptians are going to begin to look favorably on the Israelites. One of the major themes of Exodus 11 and 12 is that there's goodwill or favor between the Egyptians and the Israelites. The Egyptians gladly hand over gold and silver to the Israelites for their journey. Why? Not because they are scared or intimidated. What it seems like is they recognize the justice being done. They recognize that the Israelites have been oppressed in the land of Egypt, and they are giving some compensation for that oppression. They recognize that God is bringing justice in these actions. But Pharaoh does not. And we see that the end result, because Pharaoh is not receptive to Moses and Aaron. In fact, at the end of the plague of darkness, or the sign of darkness, see, I did it again. At the end of the sign of darkness, Pharaoh says to Moses and Aaron, "You will never see my face again." This is him saying, there is nothing you can do that will change my mind. There is absolutely no way that you will ever see me again. And this is where we're going to start to brush up on my reflection for the week. But we see that even in this, God's acts of power and God's signs, they don't control Pharaoh. But these signs are used in such a way that we see Pharaoh isn't in control. Everything about this has been to prove to Pharaoh he is not in control. And his last word to Moses and Aaron is, "You're not going to come in. You're never going to see my face again. I am in control." And God's final action is to take away control. And we're distinctly told that this is an action against the deities of Egypt, the religious ideas of Egypt, that that they somehow believed that Pharaoh was in control of life and death. Pharaoh, as the son of Osiris, had some power to preserve life in the kingdom. And what this sign is designed to do is to show Pharaoh, no, you don't have that power. The power of life and death belongs to God, because all life stems from God. And if you will not give to God the firstborn, if Pharaoh, if you're not going to give over God's firstborn, then God is going to require some acknowledgement, and that is your firstborn. And it's a very harsh penalty, but even then, even in all of this, we still have this kind of gray area. Is God actually killing Egypt's firstborn, or is God relenting and allowing this third party, this angel of death, to come in and destroy Egypt's firstborn? There's some real question here, and I think the text is very ambiguous in this, because in some way we recognize that God is responsible because God is relenting, or ceding control over life, but in some way there is this recognition that God is not directly responsible for the death, because God is the author of life. And the tension is there in the text, and I think it's there to help us remember that there is a genuine tension in the world, that we don't understand completely life and death and how they react, or how God interacts with both of those. And I think it's, to me, a humble reminder that I don't know everything, because frankly I can't make complete sense out of this passage. But the general gist of it is there. Pharaoh has said, I'm in control. I am going to hold God's firstborn ransom. I'm going to hold them under my power, under my control, and there's nothing you can do about it. And God has said, no, I can do quite a lot. Let's see how much it'll take before you will grow up, learn the lesson, and let them go. And the truth is, Pharaoh never does. Pharaoh never grows up. Pharaoh never matures. Pharaoh never learns the lesson, because even after Pharaoh sends the people away at the end of, or I guess kind of in the middle of chapter 12, in verses 31, right around 31, even though Pharaoh seems to learn the lesson and sends the people away, we see that he quickly has a change of heart when he recognizes that this harms his power and his control, or at least his air of control. And that ultimately leads to his demise, which is what we will pick up with next week. And we'll pick up with that in relationship to Easter. And since I'm going to pick up with that in relationship to Easter, I might as well close this segment out with relating a little bit the Passover to the Easter celebrations, because in one sense, Christians don't celebrate the Passover. We really don't. This is Jewish history. It is not necessarily our history. It is a Jewish celebration and a Jewish feast. It is not inherently a Christian one. However, we do see that Jesus, when he comes to the end of his life, he understands himself as reconstituting the Passover, as he is giving new and slightly different meaning to the meal that is celebrated here. He is saying this is another work of God's blessing, of God's power. And as you come together to celebrate, remember this new act. And so in some ways, we don't celebrate a Jewish Seder. And I think in some ways it would be a little impolite to celebrate a Jewish Seder. But at the same time, we can understand the context of our communion, our Eucharist, comes out of that Passover meal, where Jesus sits with his disciples and eats the lamb, eats the bread, eats the bitter herbs, drinks the wine, and gives it a new and different meaning. One where he becomes, in some ways, the sacrifice that allows for the freedom of the people. And that is a profound story. It's one I'm not really prepared to pick up on right now because that's a whole video in and of itself, but it is certainly relevant, and it's something we should be meditating on during this upcoming week as we prepare for Easter. And so with that, I'm going to say goodbye as always. If there are questions or comments, feel free to reach out to me. I thank all those who reached out to me to let me know about the audio problems with last week's episode. I hope I've got those all worked out. But again, if you have questions, comments, or any feedback, please let me know. I'd love to interact with you. And until we meet again, God bless.